Alright, with that, we are officially underway with the first episode of the Jasu Review. Hello and welcome. This is the Jasu Review podcast, weekly podcast wherein I talk about the games I've been playing lately, how the playthroughs have been going, what I think of them, and just how things are going here on Twitch in general. That's going to be the main feature of the podcast, is just talking about the stuff I've been playing lately. We'll dive into a bit of discussion topics, current events, that kind of stuff, but less of that and more focus on the games. It's going to be pretty non-interactive, although I'll open it up for viewer and listener questions and discussion at the end of the podcast if anyone happens to be watching at this point. So that's what this is. I'll take a moment to discuss a little bit of why I'm doing this. Basically, I thought it would be a good way for regular viewers to catch up with what's been going on with the channel here, all the playthroughs and such. Just because I know people out there, they're either busy or they live in different time zones and they can't keep up with the 20 hours or whatever of Twitch streaming that I do every week. So this podcast is a nice way to just keep everyone up to date every week. And also for you guys to interact with me as well. If you have something you want to ask me about or something you'd like to hear me talk about, or you'd like to give some feedback in some way but haven't been around to catch the live streams, you can just drop me a line on Twitter, Twitch, YouTube, DM, whatever. And yeah, I will answer your questions at the end of the podcast, if there's any interest. The other main reason I'm doing this is just because for a long time I've been looking for a format to discuss my opinions on the various games I've play here on the channel. Mostly I just talk about them during the actual playthroughs. I usually do a big wrap-up during the credit sequences of whatever game I'm playing, but it's not very permanent. Like Twitch streams are kind of transient thing. They kind of exist out there in the ether. Not a lot of people dig into the VODs and watch, again, all 20 hours a week to keep up to date. So this would be a good way for me to express my opinions in a more listenable, more permanent, and digestible format for you guys to listen to if you're if you're at all interested in such a thing. And the other reason I'm doing this is just for variety's sake. I thought it'd be nice to try something a little bit different from the standard, let's play Twitch stream, basically playing video games and talking over them. This time we're just talking about video games without the video games. What a concept. So that's the idea here. I hope you enjoy it, and yeah, I hope it goes well. Here's hoping. And oh yes, and so the first thing we're going to be discussing here, speaking of focus on the games, is Shining Force. I've been doing a playthrough of the Shining Force series. We're going to be talking about that right away, and here it goes. Okay, so the main focus of the channel for the last several months, going back to near the beginning of the year, at the end of January, I've been doing a playthrough of the Shining Force series, or the mainline Shining Force series, starting with Shining Force 2, actually. So I guess really just Shining Force 2 and 3, for reasons I'll be getting into in a moment. For starters, I think I'm just going to give a brief overview of what this series is. And just a brief summary of the history. So this is a series of tactical RPGs that was originally released. It all got started on the Sega Genesis, developed by Camelot Software Planning, which was known as Team Sonic or Sonic Software Development, something like that. Different from Sonic Team, completely different studio, no relation whatsoever, who are also known as Camelot Software Planning. So the original Shining Force was released in, I believe, 1993, although it wasn't actually the beginning of the series. There was actually the Shining Force games, which are the tactical RPGs, Shining Force 1, 2, and 3, and then the Gaiden games over on Game Gear. And then there's also the wider Shining series, which all takes place in the same universe, but they're different types of games. And in fact, the first Shining game wasn't Shining Force. It was Shining in the Darkness, which was a first-person dungeon crawler, again on the Sega Genesis, with the same set in the same universe, the same sort of graphical style and character designs you see throughout. I believe there are also some recurring characters that appear in both the first-person RPGs and the mainline Shining Force games. And apart from Shining in the Darkness, there was also Shining the Holy Ark, which was another first-person strategy, or first-person dungeon crawler. And then Shining Wisdom, which was an action RPG, both of those on the Sega Saturn. And then there's the much wider Shining series, which basically all the games that came after those, the series got taken away from Camelot's Software Planning and went over to various other development studios over the years. But that was kind of the end of the original Shining Force series. The later games are really a completely different thing, talking about the Shining Tears, Shining Soul, tons of games. There's at least a dozen games, I think, in the series from them, although it's not really the same series anymore. Camelot Software Planning Shining games are a very, very different breed from the Shining games that came afterwards. So we're going to be focusing on the classic Shining Force right here, those Camelot Software Planning games, and in particular the Shining Force series of strategy RPGs, Shining Force 1, 2, and 3. So maybe just to give a brief summary then so that's the history of the series itself. And if you want to know more detail, there's actually a great fan site. It's called Shining Force Central. If you want to know about the history of the series, there's a lot of great information over there. Developer interviews, all that kind of stuff. As far as my history with the series, I actually don't have a very long history with the Shining Force games. I was a Genesis kid back in the day, but I didn't get into RPGs until later on. It would have been like a few years after I got my Genesis, I got my Super Nintendo, and then I started getting into the RPGs with all the Squaresoft games over there, Final Fantasy, Chrono Trigger, Lufia, all that good stuff. And I never went back to check out all the RPGs on Genesis that I had missed. It never occurred to me. So I missed out on games like Shining Force, Phantasy Star. Didn't grow up with those, didn't play them as a kid, although I tried them years later via emulation when I was getting into emulating old games that would have been around when I was in high school. And so I did try out Shining Force 1 and 2 on Genesis, and I wasn't exactly a big fan. So I was, or maybe to talk a bit about how I got into tactical RPGs. I wasn't into tactical RPGs at all at that point, really. So I tried out Shining Force, and I couldn't really get into it. I tried Shining Force 2, and it was kind of too hard for me. I think I got stomped multiple times in the very first battle. And then later on, I also tried out a couple other strategy RPGs at around that time. Final Fantasy Tactics, which was also too difficult and complicated for me. And then Vandal Hearts. It was the first strategy RPG that was kind of at the level where I could get into it. I was also, getting older. My teenage brain was more able to grasp the basics of just tactics and strategy and all that. So Vandal Hearts was where I really got my start into tactical RPGs. Went back and played Final Fantasy Tactics. Loved that. One of my all-time favorite games. Went back and tried Shining Force again. Still not a big fan. It was kind of a big step back from what I'd played already. Big step back from the strategy RPGs I was already familiar with. But I'm the kind of guy, I like to try things multiple times over the years to see whether my opinion has changed over the years, whether I'm enough of a different person to appreciate whatever it was I was missing the first time around. So I often go back to these old games that I don't think that I like, just to see if anything's changed in my perspective, in my way of thinking, to let me enjoy them this time around. I've actually discovered a lot of great games that way. I hated King's Field back in the day. Love it now after trying it years later. And so I thought we might And so, yeah, that's one example. And I thought we might give the Shining Force games another try. And I decided I was going to try to do that on stream here, actually, starting with Shining Force 1. So I will let you guys know how that went after the break. So, Shining Force 1, I actually ended up playing this one off stream for the reason being I decided to do a test play because I wasn't sure that I was going to like this game. Like I said, I'd tried it a couple times before, and I didn't want to do a series of streams of just me shitting all over this beloved classic game. Because I know that Shining Force is a cult classic of sorts, or not, it's even maybe even a mainstream classic. This was a lot of people's entry point into the strategy RPG genre. For me, it was Vandal Hearts many years later, but for a lot of other people, it was Shining Force. I find that on Genesis, there is a particular almost cult. So I can't think of a better term other than a fanboy cult around games like Phantasy Star and Shining Force. Just because SNES, we were on the SNES, it was full up on all sorts of RPGs of all sorts between all the SquareSoft and Enix releases, whereas Sega Genesis, it was pretty much Phantasy Star and nothing else, and then Shining Force and nothing else. So as a result, you've got a very dedicated following as kind of the fallout of the console wars from back in those days. And it was always my opinion that that's kind of all it was the fanboy cult in the pejorative sense, and that all of the SNES RPGs were objectively superior to Phantasy Star, and all of the later strategy RPGs on PS1, Vandal Hearts, Final Fantasy Tactics, were clearly superior to Shining Force. So that's kind of the old perspective I had back in the day as a teenager. This is like, oh, the people, these Shining Force games, and Phantasy Star 2 for that matter, were games that people liked because they didn't know any better, because they didn't have access to all the good stuff on Super Nintendo. So that's where I used to be coming from here. I don't hold that perspective anymore. But that's kind of the old mindset I had going into this. So, I didn't want to. And so, anyways, I know that this game has that sort of dedicated following, so I didn't want to do a stream just shitting all over it constantly. And so that's the reason why I didn't end up playing this on stream, because I tried it again, played several hours off stream as a little test play, and I still do not much care for the original Shining Force. It feels archaic and clunky to me. There's a lot of weird... It's got the weird, like, old school Dragon Quest style interface where you can't just hit a button to talk to a townsperson. You got to hit a button to bring up a menu and select talk from the menu to talk to an NPC, and then you've got to select search from the menu to search a barrel. It's just it's, the context sensitive action button is a thing that had been invented by this point. It just seems so weird to me that that you have those weird sort of archaic holdovers from the days when we only had a 2-button controller to work with. That's one thing. Other than that, I didn't like the tactical battles very much either. They felt, again, kind of slow and clunky. A lot of the maps are highly congested around these tiny little choke points. There's a lot of difficult terrain, so you basically move very slowly across the map to the next choke point, and then you slug it out, and there's not a lot of opportunity for maneuvering or tactics of any sort, because you're on your one tile bridge fighting the enemy. Or at least that's the way that most of the maps tend to be, I found, at least for the first, I think I played like 6 or 7 hours of this one through the first probably 8 or 9 battles, I would say. So yeah, it's got these slow, grindy battles. Terrible AI as well. The AI is just a cakewalk in this game. They've got this sort of the sort of brain dead enemy AI you see in a lot of kind of bad strategy RPGs, where the enemies basically, they'll do one of two things. They'll either rush at you instantly and just forward like zombies, just gunning right for you, hitting the weakest character they can pick out, or they'll just stand there until you get in range of them, and then they'll fight you. There's also a third AI option in this game, which is the enemies that just stand there and never move, and you just pick them off with archers and magic, and they do nothing. It's very strange. So yeah, this game had very bad AI as well, and the turn order system is really janky and weird. It's almost completely random. There's an agility stat that determines that helps determine the turn order, but it's actually, you essentially get an initiative roll every combat round that's influenced by your agility, but there's a lot of randomness, so there's no predicting what the turn order is going to be in any given round, which makes it very difficult to strategize and plan out your turns and whatnot, because you never know when the enemy is just going to activate all at once and kill half your force, or get two turns in a row. If the enemies all roll low one round and get high initiative the next round, then they all get two turns in a row, and it's just whatever. Did not care for Shining Force, but with all that said, there's some good stuff here too, and you can kind of see the heart of the series. A lot of the good stuff does shine through in this one. It wasn't a complete. It's not an utterly terrible game or anything. It's just a kind of a bit dull for my taste. I don't like the strategy battles, but the other stuff, the fundamentals of the series are all here, and I think you can see that there's a lot of potential for them to improve things from here. So the best thing about the series, hands down, is just the presentation, the character designs, graphic style. Is just all fantastic. I love this kind of cartoony fantasy style, kind of reminiscent of a lot of 80s fantasy cartoons, particularly the Black Cauldron. This one reminds me a lot of, and actually I've seen in interviews with the developers that Disney animated films were a big influence for them. I should have written his name down. The main director of the entire Shining series. I should have written his name down, but that's something we'll clean up for future podcasts. Better research. But yeah, the presentation is great, and you got the series kind of signature feature, which is the awesome looking cinematic combat scenes where when you attack, when the characters are attacking each other, it cuts to like this really awesome sweeping fully animated cinematic battle scene where you see the characters hack away at each other, and it looks awesome. Like, talking about how the presentation is the best thing with the great characters designs, art style, all of that really shines forth in those combat scenes. And apart from that, the music is all right, but in general, I love the aesthetic of the game. It's just it kind of falls flat on the mechanical side. The basic concept is pretty unique too, so I guess that's another thing that you can see if you can look past the kind of antiquated mechanics. That's the basic concept of the series. It's a sort of a strategy RPG that leans very heavily on the RPG side of things. So essentially, that means that there's a lot of stuff here that's borrowed from Fire Emblem, like the way combat mechanics are basically the same, but you don't have permadeath, so it's a lot more accessible in that way. And as far compared to the sort of medieval political and warfare-based stories in Shining Force games, here you've got more of a traditional heroic fantasy story. Again, something a bit more reminiscent of something like the Black Cauldron or a Dragon Quest. That's essentially kind of how I view the Shining Force series. It's sort of a hybrid of Fire Emblem and the Dragon Quest. In fact, it even has the resurrection mechanics from Dragon Quest, and the turn order system as well, for what it's worth. Also, one thing worth noting in Shining Force 1 is there's some unique science fiction-y aspects to this game that they kind of abandoned for later games. I didn't play far enough to see it, but I've seen video and screenshots of this game where you see a bunch of like robots and missiles and lightsabers and stuff in the later portions of the game, which actually seems really cool and almost convinced me to push through to the end to see when all of that starts getting introduced. And you don't really see that kind of stuff in the later games. It's more pure fantasy from Shining Force 2 onward. But yeah, that's kind of my final take. There's a lot of good stuff here. You can see they sort of formed the core of the series, the basics. But the strategy RPG mechanics weren't quite up to snuff here, at least in my opinion. Like I said, I only played the first 6 or 7 hours. Maybe it gets better after that, but I didn't want to play a game that I thought would be boring on stream. Although one thing of note is that there was actually a remake of this game. It was not by Camelot Software Planning. This one came years and years later on the Game Boy Advance. It's called Shining Force Resurrection of Dark Dragon, and supposedly that I hear that one is a lot more modernized, a lot more user friendly, and is generally, I think, considered to be an improvement over the original, other than the graphics and music, which are, it's Game Boy Advance, so obviously it's going to be worse. But it's kind of piqued my interest, and I might try out Resurrection of Dark Dragon on stream at some point in the future. But yeah, Shining Force was kind of a dud for me. So, but it was the first game of the series. Maybe they improved things from there. So I decided to pick up Shining Force 2 and do a test play of that. And for those of you who follow the stream, you'll know that I did end up playing that one on stream here, which gives you a bit of a clue as to what my opinion of that one ended up being. And we're going to start talking about that right away. So, Shining Force 2 is another game that I didn't really have any history with, other than trying it out a couple times before through emulation. I was kind of a dumb kid, so like I mentioned earlier, I never actually managed to get past the first battle back in the day, or rather, I gave up rather early. You can grind your way through it, obviously, but it just seemed like the game is... At this point, I was kind of so turned off from Shining Force 1 that I figured, oh, this battle's too hard, balance in this game is obviously garbage, there's something wrong with the game that I can't get through this first battle. Again, my mindset way back in the day as a teenager. So yeah, I failed the first battle, but I figured, this time around, I'm older, wiser, a lot more experienced with this type of game, better at strategy games. Maybe this one will go better. And in fact, maybe I'm so clever, and this was the thing. I started up the game and I saw the difficulty select screen, which is kind of a unique thing in this type of game. I don't know that I've ever played another strategy RPG that had different difficulty settings. So I looked up what the different settings do online, and it turns out that the hardest difficulty setting, ouch, does nothing. But it's bugged or something like that. It's supposed to have better enemy AI. In fact, if you read the manual to this game, that's what it advertises, is ouch difficulty, improved AI, but it's really exactly the same. But on super difficulty, the one below that, it buffs up the enemy's attack strength by, I think it's 15%, which I thought, oh, that seems reasonable. Maybe I'm even smart enough to play this game on super difficulty this time around. And I tried that out, and I did lose the first battle on my first test play of this game, but it was really enjoyable. So I kept at it, and I got it on my second try, and I played further from there, and I realized, oh, this game's actually a lot better than the first one. They refined a lot of the a lot of the problems I had with the first game have been ironed out here, and there's much less to complain about in general. So I decided, okay, that's what we're gonna do. We're gonna do a super difficulty playthrough on stream, and I liked it. This Shining Force 2 is a really fun game, vastly improved over its predecessor without being really revolutionary, oddly enough. It, again, the core of the series, the heart of the Shining Force series, had been established in the first game. It was there right from the beginning. It just didn't have that additional polish or the mechanical soundness to really appeal to me. Here, not only did they remove a lot of the problems I had with the game, they fixed the problems I had. They also made the stuff that I liked a lot better. So more of the good, less of the bad is kind of my take here. All the good stuff is a lot better. All of the bad stuff is not quite as bad or has been smoothed out entirely. Just right away you can see that there's a great improvement in graphics and sound here. The soundtrack to Shining Force 1 was kind of meh. There were a few good tracks. I didn't think it was amazing overall. Shining Force 2 has an amazing soundtrack. I had a hard time picking out just which bit of the soundtrack I was going to use to introduce the game. But of course it had to be the main theme in the end. It's just iconic, a classic piece of video game music, one of the all-time greats, I would say. This is one of the all-time great gaming soundtracks. Some of the best graphics on the Genesis as well. The cinematic combat scenes, even more well-animated, more detail on the sprites, just better looking overall when they looked really great in the first place, to be honest. But then apart from that, they actually improved all of the stuff that I thought was not so great about the strategy battles. So the maps are a lot more open this time around. You have more leeway to actually position your characters and have a strategy. What was the other stuff? Sorry, this is going to happen from time to time just because I'm not used to talking at this length live. Anyways, the other thing was that the enemies were kind of all the same in Shining Force 1. That's kind of still the case here, but what you find is there's a lot more mages on the maps, and they have much better AI as well. Right, that was the thing I was searching for, was the AI is actually much improved here, to the point where I'd honestly say this is some of the best AI I think I've seen in a strategy game. It could be just randomness, could be all inside of my head. One of the coolest things I think is that the enemies don't just stand still. Like in the original Shining Force and a lot of other strategy RPGs, you can kind of tell what an enemy's all about just by the way they behave right from the first round. Either they're the type of enemy that sits still, or they're the type of enemy that's going to rush you. There's basically those two types of enemies you see in most strategy RPGs. Here, this is such a tiny little thing, but it does such a great job of getting inside your head. The enemies don't just idle. They will shuffle around a few squares when they're the types of enemies that just sit still and don't rush you will still shift around a couple squares every turn. So you don't know, are they edging towards me, or are they just kind of random walking? So it kind of puts you on edge. It's like, oh, that guy just moved 3 tiles toward me. What's he doing? Do I have to worry about the enemy charging forward with their reserves, or is he just pacing back and forth? And it's a little thing, but it does a lot to improve the sense, kind of make the enemies come to life in a sense. And you don't have the stupid enemies that just sit there doing nothing anymore. Also, it seemed weird to me that the timing on the enemies, it would almost seem like they would coordinate their attacks from multiple fronts. Like you would see an enemy charge forward and then slow down a little bit, and then the enemy on the other side would charge forward. They kind of align their movements to be able to coordinate attacks on multiple fronts. I don't know if that's just in my head or a coincidence, but I don't know. I was really impressed in general by the AI in this game. Massive step up from the first one. With that said, a lot of the stuff I didn't like about the first game is still kind of here, but it's not as bad. One thing I forgot to mention was kind of the swingy RNG in the original Shining Force. Just like in other RPGs, you've got critical hits and dodges and that kind of thing. You also have double attacks, and in this game, it really swings the tide of battle when just a badly timed miss or crit or double attack. Mind you, a lot of that is due to the fact that I was playing on super difficulty. In general, I got the sense that the game was not really balanced around the enemies having all of this extra attack strength. I said that it's only a 15% bonus, but that actually ends up being really significant. It's not 15% to damage, it's 15% to the enemy attack stat. And the combat math in this game is just straight subtraction. It's attack minus defense. So for example, if an enemy has 100 attack and I've got 99 defense, if you buff up that enemy's attack by 15%, suddenly he's got 115 attack. So he goes from doing 1 damage to 16 damage with that 15% bonus. And that's kind of what you see with a lot of the enemies on super difficulty, is they go from doing like 2 or 3 points of damage to like 12 points of damage. It often more than doubles the amount of damage they do, which means a lot of the time you guys get 2-shotted or 1-shotted if the enemies get a double attack or a crit. But again, part of that was just me being stubborn and deciding that I wanted to play on super difficulty. I think I would have enjoyed my time with the game just a little bit more if I'd played on the default setting. I have kind of 2 contradictory problems with the game too, where it's on the one hand, the battles get kind of samey after a while. Like I mentioned how I liked that the battle maps are a lot more open. You got a lot more freedom to position your troops and stuff, but too many of the maps are too open. It almost felt like there was kind of lacking in variety and lacking in enemy variety as well. There's basically 3 types of enemies: melee enemies, archers, and spellcasters, and there's not a lot to differentiate within those few types. Like you'll see an enemy, and then you'll see a new enemy, and he's basically the same as basically every new set of enemies is the same as the previous one. They just have more stats. Now the game, to its credit, tries to mix things up a bit. You've got some unique set-piece battles, boss fights, fights with unique mechanics, that kind of stuff. So it's good in theory that the game does that to give you that bit of variety. But most, in fact, almost all of these gimmick set-piece battles are terrible, in my opinion. You got the stupid Kraken fight where you're stuck on this tiny little raft and you got tentacles assaulting you from the water. And it's just a dull fight. These tentacles have tons of HP, tons of attack strength, and there's nothing for you to really do other than just sit there and wait for them to come to you, or else you'll get destroyed. So it's just a long, tedious fight. And again, not very well balanced for super difficulty. You've got the darkness battles, which sounds like it would be a fog of war type thing, but it's not. It's just that you've got a little light that shines around your cursor. So if you want to see what's on the combat map, you've got to wave your cursor around like a flashlight to actually be able to see where the enemies are, which is just stupid and tedious. You've got the chessboard fight where it's like you've got a ton of enemies. It's like a full chess set worth of enemies. It's really cool in concept. I actually really like that portion of the game in general where you get shrunk down and fight like in a rat hole and on the chessboard and all of that. It's, again, that kind of fun, cartoonish, adventure-y stuff, almost like it's something you'd see in a Disney movie. But the mechanics of the chessboard fight is just, you basically got a bunch of super strong enemies that are, it's a battle against overwhelming odds. There's no way, just stat for stat, in a full-on brawl with these things on a big open chessboard, there's no way you'll win. But thankfully, the enemy AI gets suddenly very stupid on that fight. You've got the old AI where some of the enemies just stand still and don't attack you. So you've got to kind of use trial and error, basically, to figure out how the chess piece AI works and try to abuse it to your advantage to win that fight. And it just felt kind of janky and tedious and unfun, which describes a lot of the gimmick fights in Shining Force 2, I think. This is actually something that the series in general kind of struggles with, I think, or Camelot Software Planning in general. They're kind of there's a lot of a lot of fantastic creativity and stuff in their games, I find. They also developed Beyond the Beyond and the Golden Sun games, which again, really neat games with a lot of cool ideas, great aesthetics, and then a lot of jank that just doesn't quite work. But apart from that, I don't want to harp on all the bad stuff, though. Like I said, I liked the game overall. All the good stuff from the first game is still here. You've got a fabulously just diverse cast of characters. You can see some of them here on the Japanese box art that shows it off a bit better. I always thought it was so cool that you've got all these non-human characters here. You got the Ratman, Centaurs, Turtle Man, and all with you. And the humanoid characters are almost boring. Like, I almost don't want to use them because the human characters, they're all generic characters. There's like, you got your dwarves who are the stout, high defense axemen. You got the centaurs who are kind of your high attack cavalry strike force, your human mages, swordsmen, and then you got the monsters who are actually all really unique. You got Slade the Ratman, who's kind of like a ninja type character. He's got a bit of magic and a lot of offense, but is kind of a lightweight on defense. You got the opposite of that. You got the Turtle Man. I forget his name. Whatever, Turtle Man, who's got crazy high defense but just melts to magic. He's also got a really low HP pool but ridiculously high defense. So just about any enemy attack will do almost no damage to him. There's a few other neat characters as well. Birdmen are cool. I think you get a robot at one point. It's also really cool. Just the diversity of the cast of characters here. It's not all just generic human fighter, generic human mage. There's a bunch of cool characters of all different fantasy races here, which is kind of a series signature. Again, something that they had right from the very first Shining Force game. Apart from that, the story, or I can't comment too much on the story in Shining Force 1 because I hardly played that game. Here, it's pretty entertaining. It's again kind of your standard heroic fantasy thing where you go and find a magic sword and fight the ancient evil god who's corrupted the empire and is trying to take over or destroy the world. They even kidnaps the princess in the end. Like, come on, this is all just classic fantasy stuff. Maybe too generic for some people's tastes. Personally, I get a real kick out of all of this really just staunchly traditional fantasy fare. Again, very cartoonish, almost Disney-ish. And again, kind of a All right, that's one other thing that I forgot to mention. Kind of a series signature in contrast to the hardcore nature of a lot of other strategy RPGs, where you've got stuff like permadeath and battles that you can only play once and never replay anything. So your XP distribution is really important. Another signature of the Shining Force series is that you can actually replay each fight and even exit out of fights and redo them. So your main character has this egress spell, which lets you just teleport out of any fight you want and then come back and redo it later. So you can replay fights as much as you want, which means you can grind up your characters as much as you want on a single fight. I found that it's never really necessary, even on super difficulty. And then there's also some repeatable fights as well. There are specific tiles on the overworld that you can step on to trigger fights that you can do over and over again. So that's kind of a unique thing in strategy games. You don't see a lot of strategy RPGs out there with repeatable fights where you can grind up your forces. It's not exactly a great feature, but it makes the game more accessible. And again, I can see how this was a great introduction to the strategy RPG genre for a lot of people. In fact, in general, if someone were to ask me, I want to get into strategy RPGs, but something like Final Fantasy Tactics is too complex and intimidating, what should I start out on? I'd say Shining Force 2 or Vandal Hearts. Easy. They are fantastic entry-level games. Yeah, there's the other way in which the Shining Force 2 kind of weighs more heavily on the JRPG than the strategy side of things. Is you actually got an overworld and towns and whatnot that you can explore. Talk to townspeople, search crates, walk along the overworld from town to town, that sort of thing. A lot that appeals to a lot of people. Again, it's kind of a unique thing. Most tactical RPGs, you just pick your destination from a menu. It's all menu driven. You don't actually get to control your character and walk around town and that kind of stuff. So that's one thing that appeals to a lot of people about this game. Personally, I found it to be pretty aggravating and dull. And also, I got that classic Camelot Software jank where a lot of the time I ended up getting lost in this game because it's not clear where you need to go. Sometimes you need to like backtrack to a specific, or I remember the worst thing in this game is you get an oak panel and you're trying to, I can't remember what it is you're trying to do in terms of the plot, but essentially what you end up needing to do is take this this oak panel back to this giant tree that's like 4 towns back and plug it in to a specific tile on that tree. And at this point, I've been like past this town for like 6 or 7 hours of gameplay. I don't remember that there was this big tree 4 towns back at this point. So it took me forever to find that thing. I don't think I even found it on my own. I had to consult a walkthrough. Not only that, but the tree is 2 tiles wide. And if you investigate either tile, it'll tell you, there's a hole here that looks like something fit. But it's again, there's no context-sensitive action button anymore. There is, but it doesn't work on everything. So if you have this oak panel, you actually have to select it out of your inventory. Oh, inventory management in these games is such a hassle. Anyways, we'll get into that with Shining Force 3. It's not so bad here because the equipment system is so basic. You've got no armor. So it's basically each character has one weapon and maybe an accessory, and you upgrade that from time to time. And there's not different weapons to choose from either. It's like fighters use swords, axemen use axes, and so every time you find a new one of those, you upgrade it. Simple, done. The interface is pretty cumbersome, but it's not a gigantic hassle to upgrade your stuff, unlike with games we'll be talking about later on. But anyways, so if you want to use a key item to progress the plot, you have to select it from your inventory and use it. But if you use this oak panel on the wrong tile on that tree, it says, oh, you can't use that here. You got to use it on the left-hand tile and not the right-hand tile. So you could easily deceive yourself into thinking, oh, I tried the thing on the tree, it didn't work. No, you just used it on the wrong tile of the tree. I think you have to even use it from the front, too. I don't think it works from the back. So that's, again, classic Camelot software planning jank. There's some other stuff like that, too, in the games where you have to just wander the overworld looking for the next plot trigger, which is kind of the worst parts of old school JRPGs. So some people like the exploration aspect of RPGs. I'm not a big fan, and I think I'd have preferred the game if it were strictly linear and they took out the overworld. So yeah, I think that's everything I have to say about Shining Force 2. Again, kind of a more to say here because I actually played and finished the game. It has a fantastic finale too. Really satisfying ending that just wraps it all up very nicely. So solid game, fantastic. It's amazing just how much they made such a better game just by improving and refining all the stuff from the first game. There's nothing radically different here. It's the same game, same mechanics as Shining Force 1, just with vastly improved graphics and music and map design. And the characters seem better balanced here, too. I think I'd have enjoyed it a little bit more if I hadn't played on super difficulty. Some of the aggravating fights that just seemed like they weren't well designed for super difficulty. Also, a lot of classes here, despite seeming generally balanced, seemed kind of unviable on super difficulty. Where it's like Slade, for example. Really fun character with a lot of cool tricks he can do as far as the magic and the ninja sword and everything, but he gets one-shotted in the late game because enemies get all this bonus damage on super difficulty. Same with the turtle guy. He's great at tanking damage in the early game. I really enjoyed using turtle guy, but yeah, later on in the game, just the enemy's bonus damage outstrips his high defense, and he just gets one-shotted too because he has like 10 hit points. So I would actually come back to this game someday, I think, and give it a try on normal mode and try some different characters. But oh yeah, one other side note. So we're moving on to Shining Force 3 from here, but as a side note, I didn't play the Shining Force Gaiden games. So apart from the mainline Shining Force games 1, 2, and 3, there was also the Shining Force Gaiden series, which was another kind of side series of strategy RPGs on the Game Gear and Sega Master System. The reason I didn't bother trying those is just because they looked to me like it would be more like Shining Force 1. Again, you got the 2-button controls. And also the other thing that I eventually learned is they actually remade all of the Shining Force Gaiden games are compiled and remade in Shining Force CD. They kind of did them up from the old Game Gear graphics and did them in Shining Force 2 style graphics for the Sega CD. I think it might even have voice acting. Not sure about that. Really interested to go back and try Shining Force CD someday. But I'm kind of Shining Forced out right now, so we're kind of taking a break from Shining Force now. Someday I'll go back and do Rise of Dark Dragon, or whatever it was, the Game Boy remake of the first one, and the Shining Force CD. But, and if you guys, anyone unfamiliar with the series, and you're interested in trying it for yourself, apart from emulation, which is the main way I play all of this old stuff, these games are actually legitimately and readily available from a lot of different platforms. Yeah, you can get Shining Force 1 and 2 on Steam, along with a lot of other Sega games. I believe they were on the Nintendo Virtual Console back in the day, although I don't really keep up with Nintendo stuff nowadays. So yeah, these games are readily available on every platform where retro games are sold, unlike the next part of the series that we're getting into, which is Shining Force 3. Okay, so I wasn't originally planning to play Shining Force 3. I was going to do Shining Force 1 and 2 and then check out the Gaiden series. But there was a lot of viewer interest. Like a lot of people kind of discovered my Twitch channel there's just fans of Shining Force 2 or the Shining Force series in general. And so a lot of them asked me if I was going to play Shining Force 3. And I originally wasn't, just because it was on Sega Saturn. And I don't have my PC set up or I didn't have my PC set up for Sega Saturn emulation at the time. But enough people were interested, I said to myself, maybe it's time to check out this whole Sega Saturn thing. Get things set up, and maybe we'll do Shining. I was kind of iffy on Shining Force Gaiden. I wasn't sure if I was going to do it. It looked kind of archaic, like Shining Force 1. But Shining Force 3 actually looked really interesting to me, so it took some doing, but I managed to get it set up, and sure enough, the next thing we played after Shining Force 2 was Shining Force 3. This is a really interesting game, actually whereas Shining Force 2 was just kind of a refinement and improvement of everything from Shining Force 1, Shining Force 3 is a radical departure from the previous Shining Force games in a lot of different ways. First, and most significantly, it's actually 3 games. The big feature of Shining Force 3 is that it was actually divided into 3 scenarios. There were 3 different games. There was Scenario 1, the Titan of Aspia, and then the other 2, which we'll get into later. But the sad thing is that we only got Scenario 1 in North America, or just in the West in general. Only the first scenario was translated into English. And it's like all part of the same story, so it's like not really a complete story on its own. We'll get into that a little bit later when I go into the playthrough. But yeah, originally I didn't realize that scenarios 2 and 3 were available in English. So, you know, being RPGs, I figured, oh, they're unattainable, so we'll just do the US version of Shining Force 3, Scenario 1, simply titled Shining Force 3, and have done with it from there. So that was the original plan, at least. Like I said, this, I would say, was a dramatic shift from Shining Force 2. The heart of the series is still here. Like, it still feels like a Shining Force game. It particularly with the mechanics. Like, it still plays and feels like a Shining Force game. The biggest differences come in terms of the structure of the game. It's a lot more linear this time. There's no you explore towns, but not the overworld, and there's no backtracking anymore. Which means that there's a lot of missables, which is the other thing that they added in the previous Shining Force games. You could always kind of backtrack to find the stuff for characters that you missed. Shining Force 3, a lot of stuff you can miss out on. But the biggest thing, I'd say, is the shift in the type of story that they tell here. I talked about how the Shining Force 1 and 2 were more kind of Dragon Quest style heroic fantasy stories, whereas a lot of other strategy RPGs tend to be more about the medieval politics and warfare type stories. And a lot of that is just them cribbing from Fire Emblem. A lot of stuff you see in just trends across all strategy RPGs in general is basically all those games copying Fire Emblem, which was sort of the progenitor of the entire genre. And you can see stuff in the Shining Force games that they took from Fire Emblem, but it was cool to see how they diverged from there. They threw in some traditional RPG elements as well. This one sort of went back in that direction in terms of the story. You've actually got a story that's all wrapped up in medieval politics and different warring factions, but you've got this evil cult in the background doing nefarious things and trying to revive their evil god, which ends up being the main plot in the end, which also cribbed straight from Fire Emblem. Final Fantasy Tactics also has that type of story. Vandal Hearts also. Almost every strategy RPG I've ever played has a story in that style where it starts out with the warring factions and the political intrigue, and then it ends with an evil god that's going to destroy the world. And that's the type of story you're dealing with here. You've got the rival factions are, I think it's the Republic of Aspia or Aspinia, and the Empire of something or other. It's been too long since I played the game now to remember the details. But yeah, in the first scenario, you're playing as Symbios, high-ranking general of the Republic. And so, what sets off the plot is it's actually a kidnapping. Your rival faction, the Emperor Domeric, gets kidnapped at the start of the game, and the leader of the Republic, Benetrim, gets framed. And so you're basically chasing down these cultists, you're trying to return I think it's King Benetrim to Republic territory where he'll be safe, and track down the Bolzone cultists to rescue the Emperor and restore the Republic's good name. Yeah, I think they're engaged in peace talks or something like that at the start of the game. It's that type of story where you have peace talks and negotiations that end in a kidnapping that sparks a war, essentially. The graphic style is another big shift. Just aesthetically, it doesn't really look like the old Shining Force games did, which is not a huge deal. It still looks fine, but in fact, it still looks very good in terms of just the character designs graphic. We'll get into graphics in a bit, but just the overall style of the characters and just like the look and feel of the Shining Force world here. It's still good, but I strongly prefer the aesthetics of the old series. They got a new composer, Motoi Sakuraba, who is composed a bunch of stuff in this era. I think this soundtrack in particular sounds a lot like Star Ocean. Star Ocean 2, which is another soundtrack that he did at around the same time. In fact, almost all the music in this game sounds like it could have come straight out of Star Ocean. Incidentally, Motoi Sakuraba, who would go on to become the composer for Dark Souls. So even when we're talking about something completely unrelated, like a 15-year-old, or I guess 20-year-old strategy RPG, we still end up referencing Dark Souls. There's just no getting away from it, no matter what game you're talking about. So yeah, Motoi Sakuraba, composer of Dark Souls, also did the music for Shining Force 3. I don't like the music here nearly as much as Shining Force 2, but it's still good. That's my overall summary or critique of the aesthetics of Shining Force 3. Not as good as Shining Force 2, but still good. Although the graphics take some getting used to. It's in this kind of weird, super deformed, almost bobblehead style characters, which, I thought looked terrible when I first saw them. But it grew on me over the course of the game. Particularly, I saw some concept art where they actually drew the artwork of the characters in that super deformed style. And it kind of clicked there. It's like, oh, okay, that's the kind of look they're going for. And naturally, you also still have the big sweeping cinematic battle scenes from the previous games. Again, the kind of the series signature, but they're in full 3D this time, which is actually, again, true to the series. Actually look fantastic. The 3D so the 2D graphics in this game, not amazing. The 3D graphics are actually kind of state of the art. I think this game was contemporary with Final Fantasy VII, I want to say, or maybe a little bit after that. And I think the 3D here actually looks better than that. Some really impressive 3D combat scenes. And also a bunch of new mechanics here, too. So in terms of aesthetics, it's a big shift. In terms of story, it's a big shift. In terms of the combat mechanics, it's kind of just more refinement and improvement, although they actually added a lot more systems this time. And I actually like all of the additions. Whereas Shining Force 1 and 2, like I said, kind of basic entry-level games. They're very simple to get into, too. Not a lot of complexity here. This Shining Force 3 adds some layers of complexity here. You got several new systems. You've got weapon skill. So apart from just your experience levels, you also level up with your equipped weapons as well. And there's a bunch of different types of weapons as well. It's not just swords and axes and bows. You've got subtypes of each of those, where it's within swords, you've got rapiers, long swords, and I think they just call them blades, which is like a big, essentially bustard sword looking thing, where it's this massive oversized sword. And they have subtly different properties, like the I think the rapier, for example, has a improved critical hit rate. And so as you level up if you equip as long as you do an attack with a rapier, you'll level up your rapier skill, and the higher that goes, the better your attack strength with rapiers. And it scales differently based on the weapon you have equipped. Where the late game weapons, you'll get a bunch of bonus damage if you have high levels with that weapon. The other thing that you get from leveling up your weapons, and this is another kind of new system, is I talked a bit about the really swingy RNG of the other Shining Force games, where it's like sometimes you get double damage and you one-shot a thing, and sometimes they get double damage and one-shot you. It's a bit different in this game. Critical hits are a lot more common in Shining Force 3. You can expect them to occur a lot more frequently, but they're not just critical hits. So if you have 0 weapon levels with the weapon you're attacking with, you get a critical hit. And then every time you gain a level with a weapon, that adds a new special skill that you can get. So if at level 1, you'll earn like the Flame Blade special. So instead of criticals, whenever you crit, you get the Flame Blade, which does a bit more damage. And then you level it up again, and then you get a new type of special move, and then it'll pick from the pool of special moves you have available to you, essentially. So maybe you'll get the slightly weaker special, maybe you'll get the really big special. So it's not necessarily always a double damage crit. There's essentially different levels of crits depending on which special skill you roll. I don't know if I'm explaining that great, but it's kind of an excuse just to add a bunch of really cool animations to the 3D combat scenes. That's obviously where a lot of the effort went into with this game on the visual side. So it's like it isn't just always a dude swinging his sword or swinging his sword with some sparks flying out for a critical hit. You've actually got like flaming swords and like boomerang axes, all types of crazy, really cool looking combat animations that just scale up and up and up over the course of the game. It's actually really flashy, and it improves the feel of the combat a fair bit, and a bit also helps the swinginess of the RNG as well. It's not all. You can expect to see these types of special attacks a lot more often, and it doesn't completely swing the tide of the battle every time you get one. Whereas for context, like, yeah, critical hits or your special skills trigger like maybe like 30 to 50% of the time, or even higher in this game, depending on your crit stat. Whereas in Shining Force 1 and 2, your crit rate was like 1 in 50, 1 in 30s. It felt like it was like 1 in 15 for the enemies and 1 in 50 for my characters. But anyways, so yeah, that's the weapon skill. Also, they added, speaking of things they ripped off from Fire Emblem, the weapon triangle is here. There was no weakness or no change in damage depending on the type of weapon you were using in the old Shining Force games. This game essentially lifts the weapon triangle system from Fire Emblem wholesale. Swords do double damage to axes. Axes deal double damage to lances, and then lances beat swords, and then bows beat flyers. So yeah, you've got that in here, which really just adds another element of strategy. It actually matters which characters you line up against which enemies. And the other thing that they added in here, which is my favorite system, this is such a great thing that I wish was in more, it's just the big innovation of this game, I would say, is the friendship system. So in addition to gaining experience levels for your characters and experience levels with your weapon, you also gain friendship points to gain friendship levels with your allies. Whenever you heal an ally, or when two allies attack the same enemy consecutively, they'll gain friendship points with each other, and if they get enough of those, they will earn a friendship level. There are multiple levels of friendship, and each character has a special bonus that they'll give to adjacent allies who they have friendship levels with. So, for example, the main character, Synbios, gives an attack buff to all of his friends that are adjacent to him. And the higher your friendship level, the bigger that attack buff. And I think your archers give you a higher crit rate. And the bonuses you get actually scale up quite significantly. Like if you get your friendship with Synbios to max level, I think it's something like 25 bonus damage, which is insane, especially in the early game. But it's also kind of restrictive. Like it's a big factor in your positioning, because you have to be right next to him in order to use it. So it's like, do I want to be positioned optimally and safely, or do I want to be positioned a little bit less optimally but get a lot more damage out of this hit? And then the other thing with the friendship system is so whenever a character dies, traditionally in the other Shining Force games, your penalty is just you spend a pittance of gold to revive them at the next church. There's not really a big penalty for losing your characters in this game, or in this series, other than the hero. Obviously, if the hero dies, it's not game over. You just get, it's actually, yeah, just straight up the Dragon Quest game over system, where you get sent back to the last church and lose half your gold. And that's really punishing. You usually want to try hard to egress out of a battle rather than letting your main character die. But in general, there's not a big penalty for letting your characters die. In this game, though, whenever a party member dies, they lose a friendship level with all other members of the party, which is, I think, a great system because it incentivizes smart play. You want to avoid letting your party members die, but it's not super crippling as compared to something like permadeath. So you're incentivized to keep everyone alive, but it's not crippling if you lose someone. You just lose this little kind of hard to use bonus that you got, and you lose it in increments. Like, you don't lose all your friendships levels at once, you lose just one. And you can get that back if you by playing smart and not losing that character over the course of multiple battles. It's just a really great system. It feels like it rewards you for success rather than punishing you for failure. Like it's also, it rewards skillful play too. Like if you manage to do multiple battles without losing anyone and get all those friendship levels, that's potentially a big benefit. You have a lot more strategies at your disposal by taking advantage of this friendship system if you've got the friendship levels with everyone. And if you lose them all, which happens sometimes because of the way the battles go in this game, talk about that in a minute, it's not like you're, back to square one or anything. You lose a little bit of friendship, and then if you screw up multiple times in a row, you lose all of it, but you can get it back. So it's like, again, it feels like you've got a reward for playing well, but not a huge penalty for losing people. So I just like that incentive for skillful play. It's an excellent balance, I think. I love the friendship system in this game. Other than that, this game... and for that reason, overall, I'd say I like this game a little bit more than Shining Force 2. It inherits a lot of the same problems that the series has had all along, though. The interface is still really janky. It's got the same stupid ring menu system from Shining Force 2, the same inventory system as well, which is even worse here because you've got all of these different weapon types. So it's, as opposed to just upgrading to the next level of sword and the next level of axe in every town, most characters actually have multiple pieces of equipment they can equip, and it's beneficial to have a secondary weapon on hand because a lot of characters, they'll have one melee weapon and one ranged weapon that they can use. So it's good to have something, and you can switch for free during combat. Like, it doesn't cost you a turn to equip your dagger if you need to throw from 2 panels away. So it's really beneficial to have, 2 weapons on hand for all your characters, and maybe even 3 if they have an additional weapon type. Some characters, for example, can use more than one class of weapon. Like, you've got this one character, he's a commando class. He can equip, I think it's daggers, tomahawks, and spears, which gives him the full weapon triangle. He can have advantage against any enemy you fight, which is really cool, but you got to have 3 weapons on him, which takes up space in his inventory, and inventory management in this game is as bad as it ever was, and it's actually worse because you need to have multiple different types of weapons on hand to play optimally. A lot of the time, I literally spent up to an hour at a time fumbling around with the shops and stuff. Or I think the best example of this, where it's like, I want to get a new staff or a new ring or something for one of my characters. Here's a good example. I want to swap a ring from one character to another. Can I just do that? Well, okay, let's unequip the ring. Oh, I can't unequip the ring because I don't have space in my inventory to hold it. So I've got to transfer something from my inventory to another character to free up space. Then I can go back to the equipment menu and unequip the ring, and then I go into the swap menu to swap that item to another character, except I can't because their inventory is full too. So I got to swap one of their items to someone else, then swap it to that character, then go to the equipment menu, and it's terrible. It's absolutely fucking terrible. I can't believe that a game this late in kind of just the history of this kind of shit was acceptable in like the Nintendo days when nobody knew how to design good interfaces and stuff, but usability was becoming a word in game design circles at around this point in history. We're getting like close to the 2000s here, so it's this type of shit is just unacceptable in my opinion. On the freaking mithril shop too, I think I spent literally an hour and a half even getting mithril weapons for all my characters before the final map. Speaking of which, that's the other kind of bad thing that has carried forward into this game is you've got. Actually, I'd say the maps in this game are less samey than in Shining Force 2. You've got a lot more variety in the map designs. You've got some super congested maps. Actually, I think one of the neatest ones is you've got a battle in a train car, where you've just got and a bunch of boxes everywhere. So you got these like a bunch of tight, narrow corridors to fight in, and it's super cramped and packed in, but there's a bunch of enemies. But on the other hand, you've also got several open maps. You've got some that are long and straight, some that are big, open and wide, some with enemies on multiple fronts, some with enemies of different factions attacking each other, which is pretty neat. But on the other hand, you've also got the gimmick fights, which are about as bad as they were in Shining Force 2. Maybe not quite as bad. You got stuff like you got a golem who throws a rock down a long ramp as you approach him, and there's no predicting where he's going to throw it, so it's just most of the time, part of the time, your whole party gets flattened. I think in general the problem I have with the gimmick fights in this game is they have kind of convoluted mechanics, but it's not that you kind of have to reverse engineer. Like, it's not clear how these fights work until you experiment with them a bit, which often means you just have to lose the fight the first time you do it. Like the way the golem works, it turns out, is he picks a few columns at random to throw his rock down. And so it's just random, so you want to split up your party. Whereas when I first went into it, it's like, okay, is there any way to predict where he throws this thing? Is it in a cycle? Is there any way to bait him into throwing it in one place in particular or another? Or there's the zombie fight too, where you've got an NPC or a guest character that you've got to escort, and he'll go around converting zombies one at a time. You don't want to kill him or else you miss out on a hidden character. And that just takes forever. This guest character is stupid. He moves only a few tiles at a time, and it takes forever to lead him from one zombie to the next. And it's just, yeah, a really tedious fight. Oh, you got the stupid refugee fight that makes no sense, where you got to rescue a bunch of refugees from Imperial forces on the other side of a train track, and the train is moving to cut you off, and it's friggin' impossible unless you know that you can flip the switch to manipulate the train cars. Although with that said, there's one... So I had a lot of trouble with these gimmick fights, or also the freaking queen worm with its infinitely spawning reinforcements right on top of you, and they get turns right as soon as they spawn. Ugh, just some terrible stuff here. On the other hand, part of it was my fault, because there's actually a game mechanic they added here where you have this one character who's your advisor. He manages your inventory and your headquarters screen and stuff, and you can also go to him for advice during battles. Most of the time, in like the straightforward fights, it's useless. Like, I tried getting his advice a couple times, and it's like, yeah, kill all of the enemies so we can proceed to the place we're going to. It's like, yeah, thanks a lot, Benetrim. I'll be sure to seek your advice on every map for such wonderful nuggets of wisdom. It turns out that the advisor actually basically gives you some good advice on the gimmick fights, where it's basically explains what to do to deal with the gimmick. Like, I think he actually explains the train switch, and I'd never bothered taking it, listening to his advice on that map. So part of that was my fault, I will confess. If I'd have been using advice more often, I wouldn't have had so much trouble with the gimmick set piece battles. Apart from that, I like the fact that they took out the overworld map. I know a lot of people miss that from Shining Force 1 and 2, so the game's a lot more linear, but that also means there are a ton of missables, like tons. That's almost one of the defining features of the game here, is that there's just tons of secret stuff that you can totally miss out on, and most of it is characters too. I think there's so many missable characters, I think it might even be possible to get through the whole game and not end up with the full force of 12 characters, which is really bad, given that another thing that becomes kind of a feature of the Shining Force 3 trilogy is the final battle. Maybe going back a bit, one of the things that was kind of disappointing about Shining Force 2 was that you got this big, diverse cast of characters, all of them really appealing. You kind of want to use all of them, but there's no reason to. Basically, you pick your core team of 12 dudes and you use them in every fight so that they can get as many levels as possible, and then the other guys just sit on the bench, and there's never any reason to swap them in unless you're just experimenting to see what they're capable of. In Shining Force 3, they've mitigated that, or they've fixed that a little bit, where at the end of each scenario of Shining Force 3, you've got a big epic final battle that incorporates your bench warmers in some fashion, where basically you'll have a battle on two maps, one with your A team and one with your bench warmers. So you've got to keep those guys leveled up and ready for battle, although you don't know that you do until that final map. Thankfully, they actually give you a little side dungeon, the Hero's Trial or something like that, where you can grind them up very quickly. And it was around this time, maybe to talk, a bit about the playthrough here. So yeah, everything I think about the game, these are all impressions and opinions I formed over the course of playing the game. And then it was towards the end of the game, I think one of the last few battles, I got a visit. Someone showed up in chat, a user by the name of Legalize Freedom, who asked me if I was playing with the fan translation. And I'm not generally a fan translation kind of guy. I tend to go with the official translations in general. There were a lot of fan translations have been around for a long time, and I've kind of got a bit of a prejudice against them just because I remember back in the days when they were mostly kind of stupid and bad. Like there were retranslation projects even as far back as the 90s for Chrono Trigger and Final Fantasy VI, and I didn't think that either of those was nearly as good as the official translation. So I kind of brushed it off when he said, "Oh, use the fan translation." It's like, And then he said, "Oh, by the way, they've got fan translations of scenarios 2 and 3," and I thought, "Oh, that's actually interesting." And then he mentioned, and if you're going to be playing those, you'll want to use the retranslation of Scenario 1 here as well, because they changed the ending in the US version. They rewrote it to kind of add a bit more closure and basically eliminate all reference to the later two scenarios. So I thought, okay, that's interesting. I am actually really curious to try Scenarios 2 and 3. And if I'm going to be doing that, I want the proper ending that leads into all that. And also, the item descriptions have also been retranslated in the fan translation to make a lot more sense. They're a lot more descriptive, a lot more useful, and indicative of what the item actually does. So it turns out that this dude, Legalized Freedom, is actually the main guy in charge of the leader of the Shining Force fan translation team. And so, I ended up, I think, if you just search for Shining Force 3 translation project, you'll be able to find that. And now all of us in the West can experience Shining Force 3, all three glorious scenarios of it as intended. And that's pretty awesome. That was just a stroke of luck. And just all thanks and props in the world to Legalize Freedom for drawing my attention to all of this, because I would not have even known about any of this stuff if he hadn't brought it up to me. But shortly after he mentioned, so I applied the fan translation patch, and sure enough, I immediately noticed a difference. It's for starters, they start referencing stuff that I have no idea about. It's like, what? The Bolzome cult has a flying fortress? Where did this come from? And I imagine that what happened is that they wrote that out of the original translated script, because you don't ever get to see the Walkyrie flying fortress in Scenario 1. That's something that gets resolved, that you end up meeting up with in the later scenarios. So I imagine that they just wrote it out of the plot entirely in Scenario 1. And sure enough, the item descriptions were a lot better too. And so I start using the retranslation patch for the final battle. Going into the final battle of Shining Force 3 Scenario 1, the Titan of Aspia, as it is now called, that I've applied that patch. And oh boy, the final scenario, it's epic, I give it that, but it also, I would say, falls into the category of janky ass, obtuse, gimmick set piece battles that I hate. So the way it works is you've got, again, two maps going at the same time. You got your main force on the one map where you're just on a bridge against infinitely spawning enemies, and you just got to hold them off until your B team over by the waterfall lifts the floodgates to flood the bridge and wipe out the Titan of Aspia, who is assaulting the capital. And he shows up after a few rounds, and so on the bridge. So in addition to this endless wave of Imperial reinforcements, you've got this Titan in the background swinging his fists and clobbering everyone and shooting massive AoE lasers. And so you got to hold all of this off until your weak-ass B squad manages to turn the wheel and open the floodgates, which is a really cool concept, and the fight itself is actually enjoyable, I'd say. Just a really epic final battle, maybe even the best. Or we'll get to that later, but it's really a really cool fight. And then you get to the end of it where it's like, okay, floodgates are open, rush to the safe spot so you don't get wiped out by the rushing waters. And it's like, wait, what? There was a safe spot. I need to do something now. And so after you open the floodgates, you've got one turn to move your party members to this this one section on the edge of the bridge where you got a little piece of wall sticking up there. And anyone who's not behind that dies after one turn. The waters rush across the bridge, take out the Titan and all of your party members who are on the center portion of the bridge. And if one of those party members is your hero, then game over. You got to redo the fight from the beginning. And that's pretty terrible because, like I said, it's a big epic fight on 2 maps. And since it's 2 maps, it's basically twice as long. Battles in this game average about an hour. And these are 2 full-sized maps, full-length maps. So it takes about 2 hours to get through all this stuff. So I was pretty angry when I got my force entirely. And I ended up spending a bunch of money, too, because all of my guys got wiped out by the flood the first time I tried it. So I had to spend all this money to resurrect them. I lost half my money. I was irate after that, but I was like, okay, we got this thing figured out. We'll try it again. Next time around, I got everyone behind the safe spot. I incurred a few losses, and then there's another phase to the fight after that. You take out the Titan, and then you fight the mastermind, Prince Arant, who's the imperial, the heir to Emperor Domeric, who staged the kidnapping so that he could rise to power and become the new emperor and all that. And he was the one. And he's got a big-ass Titan that you just took out. And so he ends up being the final boss. It's a pretty basic fight. Again, boss fights in this series, generally not great. This guy, he sits still. He's flanked by like 2 blocks, essentially, so you can't surround him at all. You've got 1 panel in front of him from which you can do melee attacks. And other than that, he just blasts you with AoE magic. He's got Spark 3, I think it is. And then he's flanked by 2 mages behind those blocks that you can't actually get to without ranged attacks or flyers, and they're also casting Spark 3 on your entire party. So you got 3 casts of Spark 3 going every round, and it's basically impossible to survive unless you've got a bunch of healers in your party, or a bunch of magic resistance buffs. So unless you're specifically decked out for this type of encounter, and also you've got to have flyers and ranged characters to be able to get to those mages, because you're not going to survive a protracted fight against all of this. So unless you're specifically set up in your party for this type of fight, you're not going to win it. And sure enough, if you lose in this fight, you go all the way back to the beginning of the previous 2-map Titan fight. So that's like potentially 3 hours of progress lost. And sure enough, that's what happened to me. So and then we beat it and we won the game. It ends on a big cliffhanger, sure enough, where it turns out that the Emperor Domeric, who got kidnapped at the beginning, was actually behind it all along. He arranged to have himself kidnapped so he could provoke this war. And then it ends on a big cliffhanger where the Synbios squares off against Prince Median, who is kind of one of the other main characters of the game, on the bridge to the Republic capital, or something like that. So it's like this bit, and then it ends on a cliffhanger like that, where Synbios and Median are about to clash swords. Incidentally, you know that Median is one of the other main characters of the series. When I say series here, I will sometimes say series to refer to the Shining Force 3 series. That is the trilogy, scenarios 1, 2, and 3. So you actually name the main characters of the 3 different scenarios at the start of the game here, even in the US version. Even though you don't actually play as Median and Julian, you still name them because they're the main characters of the other 2 scenarios. Median never actually joins your party, but you encounter him throughout the story, and he's kind of your erstwhile ally. Even though he's on the other side, he's kind of sympathetic to your cause, and you're both working towards peace. But apparently he's fully turned to the Emperor's side now, and he's gonna clash swords with you, and then that's where the game ends. Uh, I took a look at the original translated script. So instead of being about to fight each other, they just changed Median's dialogue, where it's basically Tomeric shows up and it's like, haha, I was behind this all along. And then Median's like, okay, but could we not do this? And he's like, okay, but I'll be back. It's a really stupid ending where it's like suddenly there's like this big epic like cliffhanger at the end. It's like, oh, the Imperials of a giant tank. They've broken through the walls. They're gonna storm the castle. And then Median's like, could you guys not? And then Domeric's like, okay. And then they just fuck off. And it's yeah, the original, or did I say the original? The retranslated ending is kind of dumb. But I was playing with the fan translation patch at this point, so it ended properly on the cliffhanger where you're about to fight Median. And that leads us into scenario 2. At long last, this is going way longer than I thought it would, so let's continue on. Okay, so Shining Force 3 Scenario 2, and I took a bit of a break after Scenario 1 because I'd say the game kind of ended on a down note for me. Overall, I still enjoyed the game overall, but it ended on kind of a sour note, so I took a bit of a break before going into Scenario 2, and I took some time to read up about this whole Shining Force 3 thing where the game's divided into 3 parts. So we'll talk a little bit about that here since this was all new to me at this point. So yeah, the game's divided into 3 parts, and the cool feature of this is they've got what they call the synchronicity system, where you can carry your save data from one scenario into the next. Like the characters are different in each scenario. You have a different protagonist, different party members, but certain party members do recur throughout each scenario, so they'll keep their levels and equipment and stuff. And more importantly, certain things that happen, certain decision points in the story will affect a little bit what happens in the later scenarios. So I thought that actually sounded really interesting. So as much as I was unsure that I wanted another 2 full games worth of more stuff like the final battle of Shining Force of Scenario 1, I decided that the whole synchronicity system was interesting enough that I definitely wanted to check this out. Also, just I wanted to see the resolution of the plot too, and the overall concept seemed really interesting to me. So the way this works is Scenario 2 is actually, it doesn't continue the story from where you left off in Scenario 1. It's a parallel story where it starts at the same point that Scenario 1 did, only from the other side. Instead of the Republican General Synbios, you're the Imperial Prince Median. So they're kind of opposing sides of the same conflict, although not really, because they're both kind of peaceniks who want everyone to just get along. In fact, there's almost little distinction between Imperial and Republic and Bolzome, the Bolzome cult, when it comes to the actual battles in the game. It seems like Synbios fights as many Imperial generals and Bolzome cultists as he does corrupt and treacherous Republican generals. So it's like you end up fighting dudes on your own side just as often as the enemy side, which is the sort of world that these characters inhabit. It's all just corruption and treachery, and there's very few actual good guys in the story of this game, which is again kind of typical of this sort of political intrigue type of plot line that they're going with. You see this kind of stuff in a lot of other strategy RPGs. But anyways, as far as so on the one hand, I was really intrigued by this whole notion of having the story told from different perspectives, and the synchronicity system where stuff will that you do in one scenario affects what happens in the later ones. I was also a bit skeptical of just the idea of splitting this up into three games in general. Mainly, it looked to me like this was kind of a money grab. Like, obviously, you need to split the game up because there's just too much game to fit onto one disc. But other games out there have just, released it all in one box and you just switch discs in the middle. So it's like, why couldn't this just be, Shining Force 3 on three discs? That seemed kind of shady to me. And also, apart from that, it seemed like it might also just be laziness, where it's like, okay, we made all these assets, and then here's making three games out of the same set of graphics and music. So I was afraid it was just going to be more of the same in terms of like, oh, same game with the same graphics and music and enemies and stuff. It's like, I don't know if I'm in for 80 more hours of just more of the same. But I was curious enough to give it a try, and I'm glad that I did. Most of my fears were alleviated. I think that the division of Shining Force 3 into three different games is actually completely justified. For starters, my fears about the assets were basically entirely alleviated. There's a lot of new stuff in Scenario 2, just music and graphics, enemies, all that stuff that's not completely different. I'd say it's like 50-50 new assets versus reused stuff from Scenario 1. And of course, you got an all new party as well, and an all new story too. Also, it was also very clear that the game was actually in progress as they were developing, as they were releasing these. So it's like it wasn't the case, I don't think, that they just made Shining Force 3 and then split it up into three parts and shipped it as three separate games. They were clearly developing the game as that it was being released. So like you can see improvements just to the basic game from Scenario 1 into Scenario 2. For starters, the graphics are actually improved. The 3D models during the combat scenes there's just a lot more detail on them. So the quality of the 3D models has improved noticeably from Scenario 1. There's some new features, little quality of life things that are present here. For the biggest one is they added a biography book where you can just review character profiles for all the different characters you meet in the game, which is, I think, essential if you're going to tell this kind of complicated political intrigue based storyline with dozens of different characters. I think there's probably over 100 characters in that biography book by the time you get to the end of Scenario 3. And I had difficulty following the plot of Scenario 1 just because there's so many characters all aligned. It's like it was hard to keep track of who's part of which faction too, because they're all basically against you anyways. It's like, was this guy an Imperial or he was a Republican traitor, and which town was he the lord of, and who was he allied with? And it's like it was very difficult to keep track. So the addition of this set of character profiles was very helpful to as far as understanding and following the story and keeping track of the characters in Scenario 2. That was a great addition. I explicitly said, like, games with these types of plots need this feature. When I was playing Scenario 1, I was complaining about how there were no character bios or plot recaps, and sure enough, they added that into Scenario 2, so that was great. Apart from that, the maps, the gameplay just seems a little bit refined too. I think the map design has actually improved from Scenario 1. The maps are not quite as varied, I would say, but they're more consistently enjoyable. There are fewer bad battles in Scenario 2 compared to Scenario 1. They still have problems with a fair bit of jank, I'd say, in the unique gimmicky set piece battles. They're kind of hit or miss this time around, whereas the ones in Scenario 1 were almost universally bad. Here, there's some good ones and some bad ones. You've got the stupid Electro Towers, where you've got basically you've got big bolts of electricity arcing across the map that switch on and off in a specific cycle, where it's like, it's kind of all right because it's very clearly pattern based. It's these ones, then these ones, then these ones, and there's an obvious cycle. But they didn't quite stick the landing because the electricity graphics are very over animated and unclear, so it's not actually clear which panels are in the electric field and which ones aren't. So that one's kind of hit and miss in one battle. You got the boat battle where you've got two ships kind of passing by, slowly going towards each other, and then you've got cannons on both ships, and it's basically a big stupid cannon fight where you get your guys set up on your cannons shooting their cannons shoot your cannons, and then you've got some birdmen assaulting you, so you've got to protect your cannoneers essentially, which sounds like a really cool concept. Again, most of these gimmicky fights have really neat ideas, cool concepts. It sounds neat to describe them, but in practice doesn't quite work. It takes forever for these ships to line up. You're basically spent a lot of your time in that fight doing nothing, just because you're not in range to hit the other cannons. And again, the mechanics are really unclear, where it's one of my cannons got one-shotted by an enemy cannon from full health, and I didn't understand why, and I still don't understand what determines how much damage these cannons do to each other. It's just, really unclear. You can also make the fight unwinnable for yourself. You can get your cannons taken out, but it doesn't make you lose the fight. So you're just like kind of sitting there getting blown apart by cannons, and there's nothing you can do about it. Thankfully, I managed to win that one on the first try, but it was a dumb fight. On the other hand, you've got what might be my favorite fight in the series, which is the prison break. So you've got this the situation where most of your party member gets locked up in jail, and you've got a few party members who are sneaking in to bust him out. And it kind of flows really naturally. It's about what you'd expect out of a prison break. You get a few people in, the rest of your party is locked in cells. You get a few people in, you take out the guard. The person who takes out the guard grabs the key from him. Then you got to take that person and use the key to unlock each of the cells. And then after you unlock, and then the characters that you release have to rush to the table to retrieve their weapons. At the same time that all this is going on, enemy reinforcements are flooding in from both sides. So at the same time you're breaking your guys out of the cells, rushing them to the table to get their equipment back, you've got to deal with waves of enemy reinforcements. So you've got to prioritize who are you busting out, and who are you, what order are you going to put them in. You got to protect your guys as they're moving to the table. It's a really, really cool fight. I enjoyed it a lot. And so that's the overall. I'd say that the battles overall are better in this game. The one complaint I had is so I was expecting, okay, I've kind of learned the systems. I understand the way the battles work, the battle system works in this game enough that I'm kind of more skilled at it. Is this going to be a big step up in difficulty from Scenario 1? Are we going to see the next level in difficulty where it sort of continues from where Scenario 1 left off? And it turns out it's basically a total reset in terms of difficulty. You are essentially back to square one at the start of Scenario 3. And if anything, from the start of Scenario 1. And if anything, Scenario 2 is actually easier overall, like dramatically so. Although that's mostly just because there's less unfair bullshit in this game, where like enemy reinforcements respawn on top of you infinitely, for example. There's less of that type of crap. And also the maps are just better designed overall, even if they are slightly less varied. So it's kind of a bit of like 2 steps forward, 1 step back type thing. But overall, I enjoyed the battles in Scenario 2 a fair bit more than in Scenario 1. Also, the story was a bit more interesting this time, too. I found it easier to follow again, thanks to that character profile book. And also just your median's situation in the overall conflict is just more interesting overall. Where Domeric ends up being revealed as the mastermind, the main villain, sort of, at the end of Scenario 1. And your main character in Scenario 2, Median, is his son, so he's kind of got that conflict going on, where it's like he doesn't agree with what his dad is doing, but he's also loyal soldier of the Empire or whatever. And you also get to interact with Emperor Domeric a fair bit over the course, particularly towards the end game as well, so you kind of get a sense of his motivations and what he's all about. And that actually ended up being probably the biggest source of entertainment is towards the end of the game. It's just what crazy explanation are they going to have for how Domeric's behind it all in the end? Because basically what ends up happening by the time you get to the end of the game is every single character and every single thing they do is being secretly manipulated or planned for by Domeric, where it's like, oh, my son betrayed me to stage a kidnapping to start a war, but it turns out I manipulated him into doing that because that's what I wanted, and then it gets him out of the way, and then I predicted that the Republican forces would take him out so that I could assume power again. And then this other guy I was allied with betrayed me and stole my super tank, but it turns out that was part of the plan all along. And what was also part of the plan was Median and his gang taking it out at exactly the precise moment that they did. It's just everything that anyone does in this universe, it turns out that it was part of Domeric's plan all along. It gets really ridiculous by the time you get to the end. And of course, Median has a change of heart and kind of decides to go against him at the end, but then it turns out that Domeric has his mom kidnapped, essentially, and is basically blackmailing Median with that, and that's the reason Median is against Synbios at the end of the big conflict. And so it ends where Scenario 1 ends. You just get a bit of an explanation for how things ended up the way they did on Median's side. And it's cool to see. It's just, yeah, and the plot lines kind of interweave with one another, where you meet Synbios from time to time, and you get to see what Median was up to all those times that you met him in Scenario 1. It's just a really cool way to tell the story. I like the way that they set this all up, and just the Imperial side of the story is more interesting overall, although it, again, gets almost comically ridiculous by the end, just the galaxy brain machinations of Emperor Domeric. It ends on the same cliffhanger, though, and yeah, that's where we leave off, going into Scenario 3, Bullzome Rising. Okay, so Scenario 3, we're going to spend a little bit less time on this one, not only because we've ended up going way longer than I expected, but also just because there's a bit less to talk about here. A lot of the stuff that I said about Scenario 2 applies to Scenario 3, where it's just kind of more of the same, but refined and improved slightly. The most interesting thing about Scenario 3 is it actually continues the story. So it's Scenarios 1 and 2, you've got parallel or kind of interweaving storylines told from either side of the conflict. And then Scenario 3, you've got Julian, who is kind of the mercenary who's set apart from all of this. He's on his own separate quest for revenge against the Vandal Galm. Oh, incidentally, I meant to talk about that. There's kind of a story predecessor of sorts to this game. Shining the Holy Ark is set in the same world as Shining Force 3, and it was released before Shining Force 3, and it actually has a few minor story ties to the story of Shining Force 3. I didn't actually play it. Dungeon crawls are not really my style of game, so it's pretty unlikely that I'm ever going to try out Shining the Holy Ark, but you find out more about Galm if you play that game, because he's a character in that one. But anyways, so Julian's on kind of his own separate quest for revenge, and he crosses paths with the other two from time to time. He's actually a character in the party in both of the previous scenarios, but he leaves at certain points in either of those. So he actually starts scenario 3 with the same levels and equipment that you left him with in scenario 1. And that's the interesting thing about scenario 3 is it actually doesn't reset everything back to square one. It's not way back to the start. You actually start at I think about like level 5 on your first after being promoted. So you kind of start at a bit of a higher power on a higher power curve. The game starts kind of in the middle towards the endish of where the story backtrack a bit. In terms of story progress, it's the story in scenario 3 begins about halfway through the story of scenarios 1 and 2 and then continues on from the end of those. So you see what Julian was up to and how sort of the stuff he was doing on the other side of the world ended up diffusing this conflict between Synvios and Median. And so he sort of comes in at the last minute to save the day. But what's cool is that Julian's party ends up leveling up beyond the end game of scenarios 1 and 2. You actually have a second promotion that you can take. So you sort of achieve a new power level beyond what you got to see in the previous games. Whereas, scenario 2 kind of reset everything to square one. Here you kind of, start in the middle and then go beyond from there, which is just kind of cool from a gameplay perspective to start seeing some new promotions, new spells, all that, new weapons, all that kind of stuff. Apart from that, like I said, kind of just more of the same refinement. You've got more variety to the battles overall, more gimmick fights, and more hits than misses when it comes to the set piece battles. You've got another cannon fight where you're trying to bust down the gates of a castle, but you've got the enemies with their cannons on the other side, and you got divide your force in two, one half dealing with the cannons, one storming the gate, and that's a really cool fight. I'd say the low point in terms of gimmick fights was the stupid puzzle floor tile one where you've got to manipulate these clay statues onto specific floor panels, and if you put them on the wrong ones, then your entire party gets zapped with lightning, but they don't actually tell you that putting them on the wrong ones will get you zapped by lightning. And so what I ended up doing is I ended up trying to maneuver them to the destination panels as efficiently as possible. And what ended up happening is I got all 4 of the statues on lightning panels, and my entire party got wiped out by lightning, and that was bad times. But other than that, the battles are solid this time around. I think my favorite gimmick fight is the battles against your previous parties. So unlike scenario 2, you have kind of a new party, entirely new characters with almost, I think, no carryover from the characters in scenario 1. So you've got that's kind of the way the story is structured, is you've got Synbios and his allies, Median and his allies, and then you meet Julian and his friends in scenario 3. There's no overlap or crossover between the parties, or at least very little. So one thing that happens in scenario 3 is you end up battling the previous parties. You fight Synbios and his team, you fight Median and his team, and they actually have the same stats and levels as where you left them off. Now they're easy fights because, again, like I said, you've progressed beyond the end game of scenarios 1 and 2, so you've got your second promotion at this point. You can stomp all over them very easily. But the funny thing is, even though they're enemies, these old party members, they are treated as characters. So when your party members attack you, they actually gain experience and can actually level up. Now, they do very little damage, which means they get very little XP, but the spellcasters still do full damage because there's no magic damage stat in this game. Spells tend to do kind of a fixed amount of damage that improves with your equipment. And so what ended up happening in one of the battles is my main spellcaster from scenario 1, Mascarin, and so I was kind of uncertain what the mechanics were for this fight. Is there a reason why I should avoid attacking my old allies? Should I just beeline for the guy who's mind controlling them or whatever? So I tried that. It's like, okay, I'm gonna get my Pegasus and my dragon to fly around the outside and attack the boss. And then what ended up happening is Mascarin, my main spellcaster from scenario 1, ran up and just destroyed them with lightning magic. She knew Spark 4. She had learned it in the final battle of scenario 1, and that's kind of the ultimate single target magic in the game. And she one-shotted Honesty, my Pegasus, and Mascarin got a level out of it. And it was, I don't know, that was just cracked me up. If I had thought to capture the clip or the highlight from that, I would show it now. But yeah, funniest thing that happened in Scenario 3 was Masquerin one-shots Honesty and levels up from it. Anyways, that was a fun fight. You do another one with Median. In general, the game, the battles, there's fewer battles in this game, but there's a bigger epic finale at the end of all of it. They actually dropped the political war story very quickly. It's like about halfway through the game. They wrap up the cliffhanger with Domeric and Symbios and Median on the bridge. It's actually a bit of a letdown. So it turns out that Domeric, who is like planning and manipulating the actions of every character in the world, apparently, the one thing he didn't plan for was a Pegasus to swap out his orders with a forgery and mess up his kidnapping plot with Median's mom. So that happened, and then basically it ruined all of his plans, and then he's just a background character at that point. He's just like, well, that's the end of me. It's like, who would have thought that trusting a Pegasus named Honesty would have been my downfall in the end? But yeah, that's basically the end of Domeric. He's kind of just reduced to petty revenge at that point. Oh yeah, that's the other thing, is one set of villains that gets introduced in Scenario 2 is the Rainbloods. It's actually this really cool little set piece battle where they are that you got the Rainbloods coming in, and they're these like red cloaked figures. They don't even like wield their weapons. The weapons kind of levitate around them. And they've got like insanely high stats. You can't even see their hit points, and they're fighting against the Bolzome cult leaders, and you've got to kind of finish the rest of the map before they break through them and get to you. So it's a really cool fight. The Rainbloods are just really cool and intimidating, and it's like, oh, what's going to happen with them in Scenario 3? And they're like, the special assassin squad of Emperor Domeric. It turns out that they're basically reduced to just like Domeric sends them on a quest for petty revenge, essentially, where he divides them, and so that's their excuse for why you're able to defeat these badass super assassins. Is, oh, they get a magical stat buff when they're all together. So Domeric, in his infinite master manipulator genius galaxy brain, decides to split them up for some reason. And so because they're split up, they have much lower stats in Scenario 3, and you just kill them, and they're just there to kill you, to try to kill you for Domeric's petty revenge. And that's a really sad and disappointing resolution to the Rainblood subplot. Yeah, the whole political stuff gets wrapped up very quickly, and pretty much the back half of the game is just you traveling north to deal with the Bolzome cult leaders before they can revive their evil god. It's a much simpler story this time around. A little bit of a step back from Scenario 2, I would say. But overall, Scenario 3 is my favorite of the lot, just because the battles overall are a lot cooler, much more frequent, and better set-piece fights. Although I have some qualms with the finale. So one thing with the Shining Force 3 trilogy is you've always got the big epic finale that involves all of your party members, even the bench warmers. Scenario 2 was kind of the same style as the one in Scenario 1, where instead of a big titan, you've got a massive tank, except you don't actually have to deal with it at all. It's actually kind of is it the same as Scenario 2 overall. It's like more solid, but not quite as cool in concept. So it's like you don't have the Titan for the Scenario 2 final battle. Instead it's just the endless waves of enemies. And then the B team is like they got to kill some boss to take out the tank from the inside. And then you got a big dumb final battle against a ninja and a Republican general. It's not quite as epic as the finale of Scenario 1, but it's much better balanced and not as aggravating or janky. Scenario 3, they pull out all the stops for this one. Sure enough, the gang's all together at the end. You got all three forces, Symbios, Symbios, Median, and Julian, or Jumsy, as the game abbreviates them. That's kind of it's a dumb plot thing. I'm not going to get into the details, but it turns out that the only thing that can stop Bolzome is Jumsy. What is Jumsy is the big mystery of the middle of the game, and it turns out that it's just a combination of Julian, Medios, and Symbios' names. So the way it presumably works in the original Japanese is you name all three of these characters. So the the name of the final squad, the name of the big team up of these three, is going to be the first character of each character that you named. So in the original Japanese, if you keep the default names, it would have been Jume Sai or something like that, or Jume Sin. I don't know. And there's actually a good fan site, Shining Force 3 fan site out there called Jume Sin, which is, yeah, kind of what they were going for. I can see how the translation project would... It's kind of tough for them because they can't just call it Jume-sen because you can rename the characters, so they have to come up with some system to combine your the names you came up with for the three party leaders. But anyways, they're all together at the end, except, like I said, your previous two teams are behind in levels. They don't have their second promotion. They're completely underpowered for this final fight. And sure enough, the final fight is a battle on three fronts, where you got the Julian squad in the center, and then Synbios and Median on either side, and you got three different maps to go through. You got to complete all three of them, and then the Julian force moves on to a big final encounter with Bolzome himself. But you've got to spend some time leveling up the other two teams because they're not strong enough to take it on, and it turns out that that's a lot of grinding to get through. Again, they give you that side dungeon to do it kind of efficiently, but even then, it took me a long time to grind up my party members up to the point they needed to be for this final fight. I could have... Part of it was my stubbornness. I just enjoy seeing content in games, so I insisted on leveling up all of the characters in the part. It's not like the other scenario finales where you need to level up your bench warmers as well. You can just pick a team of 12 and focus on those guys, and then mitigate the amount of grinding you need to do. I leveled up absolutely everyone just because I wanted to see what their third promotion looked like. So I could have saved myself some time there. I'd imagine if I was being efficient about it, I could have done all the grinding in probably about 3 or 4 hours. It took more like 6 or 7 or maybe even 8 by the time I was done. Or actually, it was definitely 8 by the time I was done because, oh boy, that final battle. So the first portion of it is actually really cool. It's basically just the two side squads, Synbios and Median. It's just them against just a big hack and slash slog through a big wall of enemies, and it's actually really cool, although also a bit aggravating because the fact that there's so many enemies means you need to have your party leveled up sufficiently to be able to take them on. It's kind of a gear check, but it's also a fun fight because you've got a bunch of enemies to cut through. Fairly challenging, and then bringing up the middle, you've got Julian and his squad, where you've got fewer enemies, but you can send Julian's forces to specific positions on the outsides of the map where they can draw off forces from the other maps and sort of lighten the load on Synbios and Median. And in addition to all that, you got the big ass flying mushroom, the Valkyrie, shooting lasers up the center every round. So you gotta kind of move from crevice to crevice, staying out of the way of the laser beams, or just run up the center and tank the thing and heal every round, which is what I ended up doing in the end. And then, you got a big fight with a couple Bolzome cult leaders on a kind of annoying, like a big choke point. I ended up losing a couple party members, which is bad, because just like the other two scenarios, there's this back half of the fight where it's essentially just Julian's team against the final boss, and there's no backtracking from that. If you lose that fight or teleport out of it, you go back to the beginning of the big, stupid 3-part epic finale, which is even worse than the other scenarios. Other scenarios, it's like, you got 2 maps and then the final battle, so it's like 3 maps, about 3 hours of stuff to redo. In this one, you've got 3 maps that are kind of jumbo-sized and actually longer than usual, and you got the big epic finale, which, oh fucking god. So I had a reasonably easy time with the first half of this fight, so I figured, we're probably more than prepared for Bolzome. Even though I lost a couple dudes in the first battle, we'll make a save here, and then we'll go in and we'll do the final battle. And sure enough, the first half of the final battle is you fight against the Bolzome cult leaders. You've fought them before, but here they are all at once. Pretty easy. Then you fight Bolzome himself, and it's like, it's just one dude, stationary target. Reminiscent of the Xeon fight from the end of Shining Force 2. Just a big, blowout, the enemy spams demon breath on you over and over on your entire party. So it's just fight, 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 heal, fight, 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 that kind of fight. It's almost like a traditional JRPG final boss at that point. Then he's also got infinitely respawning demon knights coming in from either side, and they're pretty tough. They do a lot of damage. And he's got like 2,500 HP, whereas the previous bosses up to this point have had like 400 HP. Now we've got 2,500 to deal with, and he regenerates like 60 HP every single round, or after every turn actually, because he gets 2 turns per round. So it takes like 2 fucking hours to get through this guy, and I can't even do it in the end. I don't have enough healing. I don't have enough resources, so it's like I have this big epic slog of a final battle against Bolzome, and I can't push through it in the end. I run out of healing, he wipes me out, and I've got to redo the whole fucking thing from the very beginning. And I took the safety save in the second phase of the fight. It's like, okay, if this goes bad, I can just reload my save, except no, because I lost those party members in the first portion of the fight, so I got to redo all that now and try to come in with... So anyways, I did a bunch of preparations, more grinding in the final side dungeon. I did a bunch of shopping to get more consumables, and like 6 or 7 hours later, we did it. We got through the final battle. We beat Bolzome, and that was it was a big epic clusterfuck. I still have mixed feelings about the finale of the entire scenario 3 and everything. It felt really good in the end. It was an appropriately epic and imposing final battle. I could have maybe 1,500 HP would have been enough. Maybe that would have been fine, or maybe if he didn't regenerate every round, that would have been fine. It was just a little bit too much all at once, a little bit too much of a step up from what had come before, whereas I thought, oh, this is going fine, we're doing great. And then all of a sudden just get like smacked down by Bolzome in the end. That's whatever. So it was basically a big redo of the clusterfuck from Scenario 1, but I still had a positive impression of the game overall. And in fact, a quite positive impression. It was uneven, certainly, but again, a lot of that being the bad stuff that carried over from the series in general. All of the stuff that's bad here was bad in Shining Force 2, the kind of bad set-piece battles and clunky interface and that kind of stuff. But it was still a great game. It was just a massive game, too. There's a lot of game here. It's tremendously ambitious. It's got a unique concept. I think Shining Force 3 deserves its reputation as just being a great classic in the annals of gaming history and everything. So whereas Shining Force 2, I was like, I liked it well enough. It was a pretty good game. The Shining Force 3 trilogy, I'd say, is actually a great game or a great series of games. Although sadly, we only got the first one in the United States. You got to go to the fan translation to get the whole experience. And I think just like US Shining Force 3, just Scenario 1 alone is not great on its own, honestly. Like, I think I like it maybe a little bit more than Shining Force 2, but it's a real shame that we didn't get an official release of Scenarios 2 and 3, and still haven't to this day. This is, the only way to play these games in English is to check out the fan translations, which is, just a real shame. No re-release or anything. And sure, it turns out that this ended up being kind of the end of the classic Shining Force series. Camelot Software Planning had kind of a falling out with Sega. It's my understanding that they actually didn't leave on the best of terms either, and the series has gone to other developers over the years, and it's not really the same series anymore. Than modern Shining games after Shining Force 3 are all different genres, mostly action RPGs. I don't think any of them are strategy RPGs. They're different, just completely different styles of games, to the point where it's not really Shining Force anymore. Which has caused a bit of controversy between apart from the falling out between Camelot and Sega, there's also a bit of falling out between Shining Force fans and Sega as well. A lot of fans of the original Shining Force games are not happy with the way the series has gone, or the way it's basically just completely transformed into something different. They want to bring back the classic Shining Force games, at least re-release them, at least give us Shining Force 3 properly in English and all of that. There was a petition actually at one point where Shining Force fans petitioned Sega to bring back classic Shining Force in some fashion. And Sega's response to this, and this was a big drama back in the day, was they shut down a bunch of YouTube channels that created Shining Force content. They went around like copyright claiming a bunch of Shining Force Let's Plays and reviews and stuff on YouTube, and that it was a big drama at the time. I remember Total Biscuit held a grudge against Sega for years as a result of that. He had a well-trafficked Shining Force 3 Let's Play that I actually recommend if you want a more detailed look at what Shining Force 3 Scenario 1 is all about. It's back up now, but got taken down way back in the day. Oh yeah, there was one more thing before we finish off with Shining Force here, and that's the premium disc. Premium disc. Okay, I forgot that. I thought we were doing another musical interlude there. The music's at the end of the whole thing. Premium disc. This was a special bonus disc that you could only get if you purchased all 3 scenarios of the game. They had like a proof of purchase, essentially, or a card that you would cut out and mail to Sega or to Camelot, I think. And then you send in all 3 of them, and they send you the premium disc. Which basically has a bunch of bonus content, so I checked that out on stream to see what that was all about. It's a really impressive package. I'm surprised that they were just like giving this thing out to people who bought all 3 games, but there's all sorts of bonus features here. You've got a model viewer where you can check out all the different 3D models and their animations. You've got an art gallery where you can see a bunch of concept art and character artwork and such. Sound test to listen to the soundtrack. You've got videos where you can see all the different commercials and trailers for the game, along with some interviews with the creators. You can find those on YouTube translated into English, and it's pretty interesting. One other cool thing, too, is you've also got a save file creator. So one other downside that I didn't get into a ton is the way that the synchronicity system in these games ended up being a bit of a letdown. It basically ends up amounting to just more missable stuff where it's like it's not like decisions you make in the plot that carry forward. It's like stuff that you missed that'll mean you miss stuff in future scenarios. Like if you kill certain characters, they don't show up in later scenarios. If you do certain things, you'll miss out on certain hidden items. The synchronicity system basically just amounts to a bunch of hidden stuff for you to miss out on. And so it makes the game replayable. Like the next time you go through the game, you'll find more stuff. You'll try the battles with different party members, some of whom you might not have found the first time around. It makes it's a really replayable game in that aspect. But it's also a trilogy of like 3 40 to 50 hour RPGs, so I don't know how much you're going to want to replay that. But to alleviate that, they've got the save file creator here. So if you want to check out all of the extra bonus or all the extra hidden stuff that you missed out, there's a feature on the premium disc where you can make a save file that's triggered for scenario 3 that's triggered whatever flags you want. So you can set it up so that you've killed or saved Spirial. You can set it up so you did or didn't recruit Pen and Penco. All the different decision points for the hidden stuff from previous scenarios. You can just trip those flags and make a save file that has it set up the way you want. So if you want to replay scenario 3, you don't have to spend 80 hours going through scenarios 1 and 2 again. So that's a nice little feature. But of course, the big bit of bonus content here that has most people interested in the premium disc was the special battles. So I checked those out on stream, where it's basically a big compilation, a big gauntlet of boss fights where you fight not only all the bosses from Shining Force 3, but also old bosses from the old Shining Force games as well, kind of redone in the new style. So you get to see 3D models and combat graphics for Dark Dragon from Shining Force 1 and Xeon from Shining Force 2, and those are the only 2 that I recognize because those are the only 2 Shining Force games that I played. But you get to see a bunch of the other guys from I think there's bosses from Shining in the Darkness and Shining Force Gaiden as well. And so it's kind of neat, a nice, neat little bit of Shining Force nostalgia if you're a super fan. And it's like, oh, we get to see all the old bosses and all the old villains in the new style and whatnot. The fights themselves are not that interesting or fun. They're basically geared for like post end game parties. So in fact, you even refight Bullzome as one of the fights, which is kind of, do we need this? And then it only gets tougher from there. Like you're expected to have like a post end game party, although you can go into these fights with any save file from any of the scenarios, so you can. I don't know why they bother letting you do that, because you're not gonna be able to make your way to the end unless you've got like a level 20 party. Yeah, if you look up videos on YouTube, people generally do these fights that are with around a level 20, 30-ish party, all promoted to their second or to their third class. I did not do that. I just went in with my end game party, which was like level 8, I think. So that didn't go well for me. I actually couldn't make it. I stalled on the 8th of 9 battles. So we got to Xeon, but I couldn't beat him. And that was kind of how it ended for me. It's kind of just your standard Shining Force boss battle. Like I said, there's not a lot of strategy in Shining Force bosses. It's always just a dude who sits there and blasts you with Demon Breath or some AoE, and you just attack and spam attacks and heals until one of you goes down. Kind of your traditional JRPG boss fight, only there's like 10 of them in a row and they all have thousands of hit points, and it's not especially fun. It's neat, a neat little bonus for Shining Force super fans, and if you enjoy grinding up and seeing all the post-game content and stuff, and pushing your party to the limits of its power, that's fun for some people, I guess. I did not care for the special battles myself very much, though, but it's cool to see, and I think the premium disc is an awesome extra feature, and that, at long last, is everything I have to say about Shining Force. Okay, so that's the first podcast, the pilot episode, as it were. This is not necessarily representative of the way I want to do the podcast in the future. This one is a lot longer, for sure. I kind of anticipated or planned for these being about an hour long, but I'm kind of wrapping up like 3 months worth of streams in this podcast here, doing a lot of different games across one series. From here on in, it's going to be, certainly shorter episodes. I'm aiming for around an hour. It's going to be a bit more fragmented, where I'll cover a bunch more different games. It's not going to be just one big series that I focus on all at once. We just kind of have some catching up to do, since I spent a long time preparing this and wrapping up my thoughts on the Shining Force series. So it's going to be less ambitious from here on in, as opposed to doing a big catch-up podcast of 3 months worth of streams. But yeah, the idea is this is going to be a weekly show where I do a wrap up and kind of in progress reviews of the games I'm playing on stream as I play them. This one ended up being a week late as well, so it turns out we have some more catch up to do. So I'm going to be covering a couple games next week that I already played a few weeks ago. It's going to be what is it? We got Iconoclasts and Battle for Westnoth. I'm gonna do summaries or reviews of both of those games, which I played on stream a while back, and then then we'll be caught up, and then we'll do the games we're playing now the week after that. And so again, it's kind of early stages of the podcast here again. So if a viewer base does build up, and if there's enough interest in this podcast thing here. One thing I would like to do is to do a viewer feedback section at the end of each podcast, where if any of you guys have questions or suggestions or things that you'd like me to talk about, I can go into your questions and whatnot at the end of the podcast. And sure enough, if you can submit them in advance via Twitter, Twitch, or YouTube DM. You can email me. I don't have my email up there just yet, but it's jasubakuhatsu@gmail.com. And also, if you're watching live, you can just shout them out in chat if there's any questions that you have. So yes, Remuko, yay, we're doing the podcast finally. It went all as good as you could expect for a first podcast. Void Crow, as far as the audio download, that's kind of the whole idea here, is I want something listenable, something that people are going to be able to listen to on the go to get caught up with what's going on with the stream here, or just to, hear a video game podcast where some nerd on the internet talks about video games. So yes, the idea is to do an audio format for these. That's going to take a little bit more work. There'll be like a few days delay, I'm expecting, between the live episode and the audio release, just because there's a little bit of processing that might need to be done for each episode. For example, I spaced out a while back when I was talking about Shining Force 2, so I've got like 5 seconds of silence I've got to cut out there, that kind of thing, where I just go through and do a bit of editing to make it a bit more listenable. But yeah, the idea is definitely to I'll do an upload on YouTube and then do a separate audio release wherever audio podcasts get released. I'll have more information about that. That's another thing on my to-do list, is to do a general podcast information box below the stream here. So yeah, I will have a link to the page where all of the audio downloads are going to be available in the near future. Like I said, I was kind of rushing to get all of this prepared for last week, and it ended up being a bit late, so I'm a bit behind on all the stuff I want to do. And also one other thing is I have alerts and such silenced for the podcast, just again, listenability. I don't want people spamming thank you, and why over the course of every podcast. So if there are any donations, new follows, subscriptions, and that kind of stuff, I will shout them out at the end of the podcast. Looks like there are 0 today, but that's fine. It's early days. That, at long last, I think is everything I have to talk about. Thank you all for watching and listening. Again, the plan next week is to cover Battle for Westnoth and Iconoclasts, and maybe a third little game that I haven't played on stream here. That'll be a bit of a fun surprise for you guys. So, that's the plan, and I'll see you then. Cue theme song, which I didn't think ahead to put here.